Greetings, everyone. I am Dr. Sandra Crewe, Dean and Professor of Social Work here at Howard University. Today, our homecoming conference, From Protests to Policy, Pursuit of Racial Justice, is aligned with our enduring mission of social justice. Howard has a long history of being ever bold to battle wrong. That's a paraphrased line in our alma mater. This conference is in alignment with our mission. At Howard, we have the expectation of boldness and leadership in the fight for social justice. I would like to especially thank President Frederick and Provost Utah for their leadership with this conference. I would also like to thank Deans Holly Walker and Dana Williams for their leadership. As a social worker, I see firsthand the hardships faced daily as Black, Latinx, and Indigenous families struggle to survive during COVID-19. I see and hear from families who struggle. They struggle in long food lines, facing eviction, and parents focused on work-life integration. Additionally, families are isolated from their loved ones in nursing homes. And quite frankly, colleagues, many of our families are wavering in their trust. They don't believe that anyone cares. Yet, I also see communities coming together, like members of the Howard family, student groups, alumni groups, board of trustee members, faculty members, and staff in lending and a helping hand during these times of crisis. We are carrying out our legacy and making a difference. We are living our mission, and we are doing this during challenging times. Today, it is indeed my pleasure to serve as a moderator for this session featuring my esteemed colleagues and an ally in the important social justice work. In fact, I consider this radical social justice, showing radical empathy, as they really report to you on their preliminary findings on their research. Never more urgent, a preliminary review of how the United States is leaving behind Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous communities. It is sad to think about this, but yet it's the reality that we face. The research report examines how well the United States and the United States in particular serve communities of color by using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a tool for evaluating performance. The results show that there are 5 areas of greatest disparity. They are justice, food and housing insecurity, education, economic security, and health. This is one of the first known attempts to leverage the UNs Sustainable Development Goals to create accountability for racial inequality in the United States. I will present my esteemed colleagues in the order of their presentations. So I would start with the presentation, and the colleagues who will be presenting are Alainna Lynch, Clarence Lusane, and Helen. Alainna Lynch is Senior Research Manager at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, where she considers the question, what will it take to achieve the SDGs in the United States? Ms. Lynch's research interests also include understanding how poverty and inequality become entrenched through social systems and how to prevent harm when designing policy and programs. Ms. Lynch holds degrees in sociology and evidence-based social intervention from the University of Chicago as well as Oxford University. I would also like to present to you my colleague, Dr. Clarence Lusane. Dr. Clarence Lusane is a professor of international relations and former chair of the political science department of Howard University. He is an activist and scholar, and a well-respected expert in the areas of human rights, African American politics, global race relations, United States elections, and international relations. Dr. Lusane's last book is The Black History of the White House, and his next book, $20 and Change, Harriet Tubman, Andrew Jackson, and the Struggle for Radical Democracy in the Neoliberal Era. This is scheduled to be released in 2021. Dr. Lusane, Harriet Tubman is my shero, and I often write about her. And Dr. Helen Bond. Dr. Helen Bond is an associate professor of curriculum and instruction at Howard University. She is a Fulbright Nehru Scholar. With a PhD in human development, Dr. Bond's expertise is education for sustainable development, Holocaust education, teacher development, and preventing violent extremism through education. She co-chairs the Sustainable Development Solutions Network in the United States, along with colleagues from Columbia University, Yale University, and the University of California in San Diego. My colleagues have been very modest in presenting their bios for you, but again, it is indeed my distinct privilege to share the stage with them as they present on their preliminary research findings. Ms. Lynch.
Thank you, Dean Crewe. You're very kind. Welcome, everyone. I'll be discussing and starting this presentation on our preliminary findings from our report, Never More Urgent, a preliminary review of how the US is leaving behind Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous communities. Next. This is how the presentation will fold out. I'll give an overview of the research and the researchers and some of the methodology, and then I'll pass it to my colleague, Dr. Lusane, to talk about the results and findings in criminal justice and food and housing insecurity, and then Dr. Bond will finish the remainder of the results and discuss the need for more and better data. Who made up this group? So we're made up of the National Center for Faith-Based Initiatives, NCFBI. The National Center is a faith-based organization that creates coalition of faith and community-based intermediary organizations dedicated to increasing access to high-quality economic programming and place-based services in underserved communities. Howard University, which I'm sure you all know well, is a private doctoral university classified as a high research activity institution and a historically Black college and university located in Washington, D.C. The Sustainable Development Solutions Network, where I work, specifically SDSN USA, is a network of researchers, knowledge creators, and thought leaders working together to mobilize expertise on the SDGs in the United States. The research team was made up of Dr. Helen Bond from Howard University, myself, Dr. Clarence Lusane, also from Howard University, and my colleague Caroline Fox, also from SDSN USA. The research that we'll present today is based on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. A brief background on these goals, sometimes referred to as the SDGs. They were developed in 2015 to be achieved by 2030. They were signed on by all 193 member countries of the United Nations. They span 17 topics and include over 300 indicators meant to measure the achievement of those topics. They vary from ending hunger to quality education, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and environmental goals like climate action. This was the framework that we used to develop and measure how well states were doing to deliver the SDGs to Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous communities. In the US, this has meant a lot of local action. So we've seen the SDGs be adopted really at the local level. So cities like New York and LA have adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the state of Hawaii. We've seen universities adopt the Sustainable Development Goals. Earlier this year, Carnegie Mellon University published the first voluntary local review. So in many countries, it's a national programming, and in the US, we really see it's a grassroots effort. The SDSN measures the achievement of the SDGs using a set of nested indices. There's a global index that's developed ranking all 193 countries on their progress towards the goals. In the US, we do an index at the state level and also at the city level. It's on the backbone of these indices that we were able to develop indicators and empirical methods for measuring progress. A little bit of background. So the US ranks 31st in the world on the Sustainable Development Goals with a score of 76.4. So the score is out of 100. So you could approximate we're 76% of the way towards achieving the SDGs in the US generally. If we drill down a little further at the state level, I think the next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. At the state level, you'll see that there's quite a bit of varied performance. So we can see geographic clustering and how well states are delivering the SDGs to their residents. The states in the Northeast and Northwest are best performing, and the states in the South are worst performing. You'll notice that none of the states are green. And so all states have quite a bit of way to go to actually achieve the SDGs. With 10 years remaining to do so. Building on the results from the state index, we tried to examine what data we could use to disaggregate by race. There are about 105 indicators we used at the state level, and out of those 105, we were able to use 34 of them. And one of the things that we found was that only about a third of the indicators could be disaggregated by race, and there are several types of racial gaps. So I'll just go through some of those gaps, one of the major findings of the report. One is that the data has not been made public or hasn't been released on schedule. So we see this with Bureau of Justice data. Often this has not been released on time. Another type of gap is that racialized data has not been collected in a standardized way across the states. Maternal mortality is a really great example of this, where there was not a standard definition for maternal mortality that was used in every state. Another way that there's a data gap is through collection, no collection mandate or no central repository. So as far as lead in water goes, an issue that has been made headlines in Flint, Michigan, but also in thousands of communities across the US and in Navajo Nation, for example, we don't have any way to track centrally where there's lead in the water, and often if the lead in the water has been found, it's not required to be made public. So that's another really telling and difficult type of racial data gap. Next. These are the types of gaps. One is that it's not in an easily accessible format. So one thing like home ownership by race and gender, or child and elderly poverty, these are available, but they require a statistical background to be able to access or some know-how. And lastly, data collection structure. So one of the things we found through this report is that often the other category shows the greatest racial disparity. So in the way that the US Census categorizes race, there's a section where you can detail a specific race that is not included, and that gets lumped into other. Often there are other situations where if a certain group doesn't have a certain number or isn't sampled widely enough, it'll be grouped into the other category. And this creates a problem because if the biggest disparity is the group other, then we're really invisibilizing those disparities and the people who are being least served by states and the US government. Here are just some of the topical areas where we found difficulty measuring: insecure housing, food insecurity, maternal mortality, school segregation, water pollution, urban displacement, or gentrification, natural disaster impact, environmental justice, and trust in institutions. So these are just a few of the areas which we weren't really able to measure in a standardized way across all the states. And you'll notice that these are some really central areas when it comes to justice. So it's really important that we find a way to measure these things and use that for accountability. Next. So this is what we did have. So as I mentioned before, about 30% of the original data could be racially disaggregated in some way. We added 6 additional topics for a total of 37 topics across the state and national level. Of those 37, a third of those included topics did not have data on Indigenous people. So this is another way that Indigenous peoples are invisibilized, both in the literature and in our culture in general, but also through data. Next. So our process was to develop a racially disaggregated index measuring how well the US states deliver the SDGs to Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous people. And then there was a second part, which is what we're presenting here, is to write a preliminary background paper, providing an overview and the historical context for the 5 areas of greatest disparity between Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous people and white people. And the idea is to make plain the human decisions that created those disparities so that they can be unmade. Here are some of the included topics that we used, and you'll see that they span many of the SDGs. You'll also note that they don't include 2 of the goals. Goal 14, life underwater, a life below water, we didn't include. And we also didn't include partnerships for the goals. Next. So as a result, we found that there are 5 main areas of disparity: justice, food and housing insecurity, education, economic security, and health. And I think, yes, I'll now turn it to my colleague, Dr. Lusane, to present some of the results and findings.
Sorry about that, guys. I was on mute. So just let me begin again and saying thank you so much for that great introduction, Dr. Crewe. And good morning and good evening and good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're located. As my colleague Alainna pointed out, one of the things we tried to do was to apply the analysis, not at just the national level in terms of the United States, but also at state level and often at the municipal level, because you can get very different results in terms of looking at these disparities when you drill it down. And the national figures can actually be somewhat misleading. We wanted to give some acknowledgement to some of the key individuals who this report echoes. Elizabeth Roosevelt, who helped draft the universally recognized Declaration of Human Rights. Ralph Bunche, who taught at Howard University and also was the founder of the Department of Political Science, and then Reverend Martin Luther King, who also promoted from an international perspective the values that we're talking about in this report. Next. So I'm going to focus on 2 areas. First, I want to talk about justice. We looked at 6 different areas of use of force, racial profiling, jury selection, drug arrests, traffic stops, and incarceration rates. I would point out from the beginning, and as Alainna alluded to, there were areas where we simply could not find any useful information. Again, either the data was not collected or it was buried, and this was particularly relevant to Indigenous communities. But to the degree we did find that information, we included it. Next. The first area we looked at was excessive use of force. There's a picture of George Floyd, who has come to symbolize and who was a catalyst to the response of people around the country to try to make this issue one that could be addressed. We know at a national level, African Americans about 3 times as much the victims of police killings. But when you look at it at a more local level, either at the municipal or state level, it can be actually much, much greater than that. In Minneapolis, for example, where George Floyd was killed, although the Black population is about 9%, African Americans constitute about 58% of those who were victimized by police excessive use. And if you look at the chart to the right, the blue lines, either the dark blue, which represent African Americans, or the light blue line that represents Native Americans, sort of jump off the page. If you look at St. Louis, which has a significant Black population, the excessive police homicide rate is about 7 times that of whites. And if you look at even in areas where the Black population is relatively small, say like in Oklahoma, you can still see that it's 3 or 4 or 5 times that of the white population. Next. We also looked at racial profiling, which is a big issue. And I would just note it's a big issue not only in the United States, but around the world as well. I lived in the UK for a period, and that was one of the issues that I worked on. I was stop and frisk on the streets of the UK, and particularly in London. And it was extremely disproportionate that people of color were stopped way more than anyone else. We looked at some of the studies here in the US, particularly an ACLU study that found 63% of those who were stopped were African Americans in Boston, although they constituted about 24% of the population. And we found that again and again and again as we looked over the data. Next. We also looked at jury selection. This has gotten better over the years due to some critical lawsuits and Supreme Court rulings, but even as late as 2011 study that we found from Michigan State Law School, about 53% of prospective Black jurors were dismissed compared to about 26% of whites. Some of the data we've been looking at most recently still reflect that discrepancy. The Death Penalty Information Center made the astonishing conclusion that the likelihood of this being random, the dismissal of African Americans, was about 1 in 10 trillion. Next. We also looked at the issue of drug arrests. This has been long-standing. The war against drugs in the United States dates back more than a century, having targeted different communities of color, Asian community, particularly Chinese Americans and people of Chinese ancestry, the Latino community, and the African American community. As a result, the incarceration, the arrest and incarceration of people of color is tremendously larger and disproportionate compared to others. We saw that according to the National Registry of Exonerations, Black people about 12 times more likely to be convicted of basically the same drug crime and unfairly and innocent compared to whites. And if we look at, say, Manhattan, Black people were arrested at about 15 times the rate of whites. It's a similar kind of figure here in Washington, D.C. Next. We also looked at traffic stops. And one of the things that was surprising to me was when the stops happen. So it's been clear for a long time, and there's been lots of lawsuits and cases around disproportionate traffic stops. But what really made the racial disparity clear is that almost all of these stops happen during the day. And the disparity between white drivers and non-white drivers, particularly African-American drivers being stopped, almost disappeared in the evening, which indicates that essentially it was who looks like they're driving that should be pulled over. And so we wanted to highlight that because, again, it shows that there's a bias out there that can be readily identified that's racially driven. Next. And then we also looked at incarceration rates, not only in the United States, but around the world. And again, African Americans are disproportionately incarcerated compared to other people of color in the United States. And again, that has led to a situation where 63% of Black people have a family member that was incarcerated, compared to 42% for whites and 48% for Hispanics. We were not able to find data on that particular data point for Indigenous populations. Next. And then relative to food and housing security, we also tried to dig into that and look at the relationship of food and housing security to the other variables and where discrepancies exist. In 2018, we found about 14 million Americans, this is people in the United States overall, experience food security, meaning that people do not have access to the kind of food they need to have healthy diets and to be able to eat on a regular basis. African Americans were about 2.5 times, a little bit more, to be food insecure than whites. Hispanics about twice as much. And again, data on Indigenous people, we were not able to find. Next, please. We also looked at how it affects children. Black children are nearly 3 times more likely to be food insecure. Hispanic children about 1.6 times as more likely. And this is significant because the health of children impacts everything from their academic abilities to just their being able to interact on a regular basis. And it can have long-term implications, negative implications, leading into adulthood. So this was a very serious, shocking kind of data point that we looked at. Next. We also looked at food in terms of farming. And Black farmers in the 1920s were close to 1,949,000. By 2019, last year, that number had dropped to about 45,000. So this has a tremendous impact on how food is delivered and how food is even thought about. We also wanted to point out that for Indigenous people as well, their land has been taken away, and even land where they're located has not necessarily been that great for producing food. About 71% of farm workers who are often underpaid, don't have access to health care, and suffer in other ways. About 71% are of Hispanic background. Next. And then also we looked at the connection between food and housing security. In 2014, 57% of 45 million people served by the Feeding America Network reported having to choose between food and housing. And you can see from this map where the discrepancies lie around the country. Again, just looking at national data can be misleading. If we look at the map, it's pretty clear that in the Deep South, in the Southwest, all the way over to New Mexico, where the most challenges are, and where food security seems to be least, is either on the West Coast in California or Washington State, or in various parts of the Northeast, and somewhat in the Midwest. Next. And then we also looked at rent burden. About 53% of Hispanic households are rent burdened, about 55% of Black households. Next. So now I want to turn it over to my colleague who will take it from here. Dr. Bond, you might be on mute.
Hello. I'm going to advance the slides until we get to education. I'll be talking about education and health. So if you'll give me just a moment to do that. Very good. Okay, I'll be talking about education, which is Sustainable Development Goal SDG 4. I'll also be talking about health, and we also used COVID-19 as a case study in which to see how these things really are really lived experience on the ground. The first thing I want to mention that we looked at was the demographics of who are teachers in our schools and who are the students, and the mismatch, or what we call the demographic mismatch, between teachers and students. If you'll look at the graph here, and I'm sort of situating my Zoom slide there so I can see the entire graph, the graph really tells the entire story. Although if you look at the stats to the left, you can see, comparing to the graph at the right, about 79 to 80% roughly public school teachers, what I call, remain stubbornly middle class and white females. You can see that, and the graph actually shows it, going across time, which is nice as well. And you can see that in terms of white school teachers, the amount has dropped recently, but it's still in the same really high area. Just 9% are Hispanic, and Hispanic is our largest growing demographic group. 7% were Black, and you notice that has actually dropped over time by a percentage. 2% were Asian, and 2% were 2 or more races. As our colleague Alainna Lynch said, sometimes that's a hidden sort of category. You're not always sure what's combined in that category. But even less, in terms of 1% American Indian, Alaskan Native, 1% and Pacific Islanders actually made up less than 1%. And you can see how the demographics of teachers does not really match the demographic of students, which I'll show you next, that has really been diversifying. And we're going to talk about next, why this is even important. And one of the reasons that we're going to look at that there are advantages, not just to students of color, but to all students, when you have a diverse mix of teachers that somewhat mirror or should mirror the diversity of society. And so I want to look now at the diversity of public school students, which are really diversifying. If you look at white between fall 2000 and 2017, the percentage of public school students who were white actually decreased from 61 to 48%. It's quite a drop. Black students actually decreased from 17 to 15% as well. And then Hispanic, you see an increase. The percentage of public school students, these are public schools, mind you, who were Hispanic, non-white Hispanic, increased from 16 to 27% during the same time period. And here's a nice graphic to give you a sense of the distribution of students compared to the distribution of teachers. And there's been a lot of research, new research that has been out regarding that if students have, minority students especially, have a same race or same ethnic matching of teachers, especially in the early grades, that they have better outcomes that tend to persist even through high school. So that's a reason that we need to be concerned in that area. There is a great disparity that we found, along with many other in education. Another area that I want to look at, and there are many, we looked at funding, we looked at school segregation, but we really wanted to look at the racial disparities in school discipline, because it's not as bad enough of being about school discipline. It's also connected with another area where there is a significant disparity, a significant gap. But when you look at what's happening in terms of school discipline, it's really quite alarming. Nationally, Black students are suspended or expelled 3 times more often than whites for comparably, if not similar, incidents. Native American students nearly 2 times more than your majority students. Hispanic students at about the same rate, although there are some differences when you look at it on a state basis. The UCLA Civil Rights Project has done great work around looking at school disparities, not only in segregation and funding, but also discipline, as well as a very recent Stanford study, and we actually use some of their data to inform our work here. and looking at on state basis, you can see that you have 6 states, Illinois, South Dakota, Maryland, Nebraska, Wisconsin, and North Dakota, where Black students are disciplined at a rate more than 5 times than white students. And you're going to see the impact of this. It's bad enough students are losing time out of school from instruction and all the other things that impact racial disparities in disciplines such as school belonging, lack of instruction, and we're going to look at how it impacts a very important other sector, which is actually school achievement, which I call one of the unexpected findings, that racial disparities in school discipline are actually it's intimately linked to the achievement gap. And this study that we used was the first to examine the relationship actually in both directions. So what did they find? Researchers found that a 10 percentage point increase in the Black and white discipline gap in a school actually predicted an achievement gap that is 17% larger than the average Black and white achievement gap. So when you have high racial disparities in schools, you tend to have a corresponding high or widening racial achievement gap. For example, as the racial discipline gap goes up, so too does the racial achievement gap. When the racial discipline gap goes down, so does the racial achievement gap. They are connected. And so that's all the more reason to examine what is happening and in regarding to this. And even though I don't have it included on the slide here, one of the things that was actually informing this racial discipline gap, besides implicit bias, the ways in which discipline and race and behavior are actually looked at, but we also looked at what we call the adultification, especially of young Black and brown and Indigenous girls. So that section I haven't included here, but it's an important section to understanding some of the dynamics behind that. Even though I have a lot of slides to go through, I just would be remiss if I didn't say something about segregation and education. We celebrate, as we rightly should, Brown v. Board, not understanding though that Brown v. Board, especially in regards to segregating and segregated schools, has really been it's really been challenged. And so we have a lot more segregation now than we often realize. And while I won't be able to spend a lot of time on this slide, if you'll just take a look for a moment, and sometimes I actually use this with my students. I teach pre-service students at Howard University. And I asked them, I said, look at the blank spaces and see if you can actually fill them in. And blank and blank students are the most segregated groups in the US. And they typically always get the first two at least wrong, and then they sort of get a sense of where it's going with the rest of the slides. Blank students attend a school in which 69% are white. Blank students attend a school in which 55% of the students are Black and brown. Blank students attend schools that are 47% Black, and Asian American students attend schools with a 24% blank population. Just take a minute to see if you can fill those in. And while you're thinking about that, I want you to, as a follow-up to this, the UCLA Civil Rights Project has also done great work, the work of Dr. Gary Orwell and others around this topic, but there are other researchers as well that I'd like to give a nod to. Here are the answers. White and Latino students are the most segregated groups in the US. White students attend a school in which 69% are white. Latino students attend a school in which 55% of the students are Black and brown. Black students attend schools that are 47% Black, and Asian American students attend schools with a 24% Asian American population. We know from the work of Brown, we know as educators that a diverse school environment is good for everyone, not just good for minority students, but good for majority as well. So the report goes into depth and also how segregation and education actually also inform school funding and how schools are funded. Lots of disparities in that area. Certainly don't want to give that short shrift. We also looked at health, and we actually used health and looking at COVID-19 as a case study on how these variables actually come together and how they work together. This is partially quoted Martin Luther King here, referring to the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare. Access to healthcare is one of the most shocking and humane. I just want to briefly share just some data from the Kaiser Family Foundation around health insurance, which is a really critical topic now in terms of being in the midst of a global pandemic. You're looking at a chart before you, looking at the uninsured rates among the non-elderly population, ages, I believe that's 19 through 64. And you can get a sense by just looking at the visual chart, the groups that do not have health insurance. Black people are more than 1.5 times more likely to be uninsured than white and Hispanics. Native Americans are nearly 3 times more. And you can see the disparities there and how that certainly informs a lot of things, especially when you look at, as we did, using the model of social determinants of health, looking at COVID-19 as understanding as health is more than just your physiological being. It impacts all areas of one's life, how one lives and what one has access to. Just another example, I have some information around environmental racism here. Another example of the uninsured population in 9 states. So we're going to look down at 9 states here. Your more orange, dark red here is the white population. The colors are somewhat similar, so it's maybe a little bit hard to see there. But you can get a sense of the disparities in terms of, you know, the high numbers of uninsured among Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous populations. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this particular graphic here. We included it, and thank you to the wonderful graphic designers that helped us put this together. But you see the 5 areas of disparity among many that our research was able to uncover using, again, the Sustainable Development Goals as the metric. These are disparities in terms of what the US states, United States, is delivering to Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. Again, the food and housing, health, education, economic, COVID-19, and justice. So this graph sort of illustrates how these things come together. Now, the next portion of this, and I'll pause as I move forward, we're going to look at some data around COVID-19 and how we see all these areas, and I'm just going to go back to this, how we see all of these areas actually impacting the outcomes that are playing out in real time with the global pandemic. First of all, just a snapshot in time. Black people are dying at 2.3 times the rate of white people. You can get a sense here. We have some data according to states on the devastating impact of COVID-19 on African Americans. Black people account for 21% of COVID-19 deaths for races known, although they are only 13.4% of the overall US population. But the slides that I'm going to show you next, and I'm going to advance forward here. This is a wonderful graphic here. We use the data from the COVID tracking project, which I want to make you aware of that, was launched in partnership with the Center for Anti-Racist Education, which I believe is still housed at American University, although I think it's expanding a bit, that collects and publishes the racial data, and they do it in real time. This data is used by, for example, it informs the work of Johns Hopkins, various organizations, and including the media. But the slides that I'm going to share with you next is a particular problem that we didn't necessarily expect to find in the research, but it's one of our key findings. And that is, and my colleagues, both Clarence Lusane as well as Alainna Lynch alluded to this, there's a lack of consistent data being collected in areas, and making it so that certain aspects of what we're trying to understand in terms of these disparities, it makes it invisible, or it lies hidden in categories that really aren't explicated, like the category of other or two or more races, where that's not clearly defined. So I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to show you a series of slides of states, and we're going to look at some of the data around COVID-19 using the data from the COVID tracking project. And you can see how the inconsistent collection of data across states really gives you a very incomplete picture when you drill down. But why is this important? Well, first of all, I want to share how the COVID tracking data system actually, how they calculate a racial or ethnic disparity. A group's case or death proportion is flagged as suggestive of a disparity, racial ethnic disparity, when it meets the following criteria: at least 33% higher than their census percentage of population. That's why the census and being counted is really important. Remains elevated whether they include or exclude case deaths with unknown race or ethnicity, and is based on at least 30 actual cases of death. Okay, we're going to just travel a little bit around the United States and take a look at what the lack of consistent reporting or collecting of data by states and its impact. And if you go to the COVID racial data tracker, there's actually ways that you can advocate, send letters, and do other things to encourage the states to actually collect and report and properly analyze data. Let's take a look at Idaho. Now, Idaho has reported ethnicity data for only ethnicity data regarding mainly around Hispanics and non-Hispanics, Hispanic, Latinx populations for only 55% of cases. Now, they have reported ethnicity data for 100% of deaths, but only about half of cases. Now, this is impactful when you look at and trying to get a better understanding. This is data, I just updated everything literally last night, so it's the most current. You have a likely racial ethnic disparity. It's sort of hard to get a sense of the cases when very little is actually being reported. But American Indian, Alaska Native represent 12% of the population in Idaho, but 30% of the cases. This has been flagged as a racial ethnic disparity likely. But you've only got 55% cases that reported, so you're not really sure what this might actually look like. So this is how it's impacting understanding a complete picture. But Idaho is not alone, unfortunately. Let's take a look at Indiana here. I'm just moving my slide over to the screen there so I can see all the information. Now, Indiana has reported race data for 80% of cases, 87% of deaths, which is actually pretty good when you look at all the comparisons. We didn't find a lot of states, let me go back here, that actually reported 100% in all cases. But look at the reporting for data around ethnicity. And we know that Hispanic populations, the brown populations have been really impacted by this. Only 46% of cases are being reported, and only 49, less than 0.5% of deaths. And we have a racial ethnic disparity here, with Black African Americans being 7% of the population in Indiana, but 19% of all cases, of course. We have incomplete reporting of data here, so we're not sure how to almost interpret that, but even with the data we have, we see that there is a disparity indicated by the icon here, and they represent 4% of deaths. So the disparity right now is in terms of cases. Key point here is look at the inconsistent reporting of data here, especially when you're dealing in a state that has wide-ranging racial and ethnic disparities in COVID-19. Let's take a look at Montana. Montana, in terms of race data, reports 61% of cases, of all cases, COVID-19 cases, and only 69% of all deaths. For ethnicity, only 54% of cases are being reported and 0% of deaths. No deaths in terms of ethnicity is being reported in Montana. And when you look at American Indian or Alaskan Native alone, which is being reported under the racial data, racial ethnic disparity has been flagged. They are 6% of the population in Montana, but yet 24% of cases and 37% of all deaths. Huge disparities. Even with the lack of data that we're getting, you can see that the huge disparities in terms of infection rates and death. This is a picture for Montana. We just have a few more here, and then we're going to wrap up and allow you some time to ask your questions. Here's a case of North Dakota, and I really wanted to flag this. Actually, I have some data just on my tablet here. Many states but you see very few that are actually not reporting or so inconsistently as North Dakota. In terms of reporting race data, they're reporting 71% of cases, of all cases, COVID-19, but 0% of deaths. 0%. North Dakota has reported ethnicity data for 0% of cases and 0% of deaths. The COVID tracking system, what I really like about it, and I think it's why so many agencies and universities and organizations lean on this data, is that there's also a way to actually advocate through that system and through some things they have built in to encourage governors and legislators and lawmakers in those states to do a better job at reporting. Alainna mentioned sometimes the invisibility of some of the categories of collection. For example, in North Dakota, 2 or more races. Flagged again for racial ethnic disparity, 2 or more races, however that's considered or combined, 1% of the population in North Dakota, 2% of cases, and you can't really comment on the percentage of deaths because there's no information is being collected in that area. So when you look at, as many of us do, we're watching the news, we're seeing the graphs, we're seeing the states that are in red, the states that are increasing. It's good to know that when you drill down, this is the state by state level that you're seeing in the inconsistency of data collection. South Dakota, just a few more, we're going to go a little bit faster here, has reported race and ethnicity for 100% of cases and 100% of deaths. It's quite a difference, and they're right there together. In terms of, but still, great to racial and ethnic disparities are being flagged. American Indian or Alaskan Native alone, 8% of the population of South Dakota, but 12% of cases and 18% of deaths, and data that you can reliably count on with their reporting mechanism and well reporting the information. I wanted to flag Texas because 6% is really low in terms of Texas has reported race and ethnicity data for only 6% of cases, but 99% of deaths, but still such a low amount in that area. And so many racial and ethnic disparities in the state's a very large state. American Indian or Alaskan Native alone represents 39% of the population of Texas. 45% of cases, racial and ethnic disparity is flagged. You see the crossbones there, 56% percentage of deaths. But some inconsistent reporting. It's certainly not the only state. I wanted to show you some states that were doing a good job, and there are some states, and often it's a mixed picture. Some states are doing well in some areas and not so well in others, but there are some states that are doing fairly well overall, and Vermont is one of them. reported race data for 99% of cases, 100% of deaths. For ethnicity, 100% of cases and 100% of deaths. Now, but still it doesn't belie that there are some racial and ethnic disparities flagged there in the Asian alone population, which represents 2% of the population of Vermont, yet 4% of all cases and 3% of all deaths. So you can get a sense just by, even though the focus here is looking at what's missing and what's not being collected in terms of data, you also get a sense of why, how Black and Brown and people of color are being overrepresented in infections as well as deaths. And without more data, better data, more consistent data, you'll get an incomplete picture of that. You see some states that are very mixed in their collection. West Virginia has done a great job in reporting race data for, and you don't often see this, 100% of cases and 100% of deaths. Kudos in that area. However, West Virginia has reported ethnicity data for 0% of cases and 0% of deaths. And it's also an area where there are great disparities. Some other race alone, which isn't well defined. Actually, there's a flag in the COVID system saying that this data should not be compared with percentage of the population, as West Virginia does not specify if this race category, some other race alone, is included under a grouping it labels other. So sometimes the way the data, the categories and the way they're defined and understood can cause problems. So you have a disparity. Some of the race alone, 2% of the population of West Virginia, yet 46% of cases and 30% of deaths. These are huge disparities that have been flagged, but you have a category here that's not well spelled out, or and so it leaves it really leaves a gap in really understanding what is going on in that state. So why is this important? I think I've been alluding to that all along, but I really, as we end our presentation today, without timely and accessible data on race and ethnicity, it's hard to really understand what's happening in the pandemic. And so, some of the reasons that we're outlined, we're really focusing on that we need better collection, more and better data to be able to understand the pandemic to its fullest extent, to focus efforts and messaging that are culturally responsive and appropriate, to ensure equitable access to testing and treatment. It's my understanding the infection rates and cases are important, and to ensure equitable distribution of resources for the present as well as for future preparedness and response. Just one more slide, if you would, and we will be ready and happy to take questions. I wanted to sort of broaden the frame a little bit in terms of the importance of data. And we did say in our conclusions that the incomplete or the non-collection or acting on or reporting of racial and ethnic data is really a disparity in its own right. And so we do focus on that, but broadening the frame, researchers from the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe called for attention to subpopulations or minorities when disaggregating information by gender. The Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination has requested that governments provide racial and ethnic information on populations, on education and employment in their reports. A need again for the disaggregation of data as well. And again, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEJA, has asked state parties for data stratified by both gender and race and ethnicity, trying to get a better understanding of the of looking at groups that occupy several categories, understanding the intersectionality a bit better. I just am going to wrap up by, this is basically part one. We've presented our research and the part two, the policy session that is to follow this, because one aspect of this wonderful conference, thank you to the president, the provost, and the deans that convened and put it together, is that we want to think about how to take what we understand, the lack of data and the lack of information and these 5 disparities, and what can we do in terms of reforming this and into transformative policies. Again, from protests to policy. And so we want to encourage you to join in to our colleagues that will be presenting tomorrow, October 15th. The title of the session, it's E1, the SDGs as a contributor to racial justice and reformation of transformative policies. University Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University and President of the UNs Sustainable Development Solutions Network, will be speaking, as well as Mr. Earl Hamilton, Chief Operations Officer of the National Center for Faith-Based Initiatives, and Carlton Waterhouse, Professor of Law, Environmental Justice Center, and Director of Howard University School of Law. They will take this one step further. So please join them tomorrow as they discuss sustainable policy solutions. And I'll end with that. If you have questions, if you'd like or to comment on our research or when it's published, here is our contact information. So thank you, and I will hand this back over to our esteemed Dean, Sandra Crewe, and thank you, Dean, so much for moderating and hosting us today.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Dr. Bond, Dr. Lusane, and Ms. Lynch. You have really provided us with a wealth of information. I don't see questions in the Q&A or chat, so colleagues on the line, if you have a question, please feel free to post them there. But I'd like to start with a question. And really thinking Ms. Lynch and Dr. Bond, this is directed toward you. There's a lot of discussion about the racial data, and I would add gender gaps that you have in data. Do you think this is because of a lack of data or a lack of reporting? Is there perhaps a conspiracy of silence? You're on mute, Dr. Bond.
Hi, I was just saying I'll hand this over. I'll let my colleague, Alainna Lynch, begin, since I've been speaking for 20 minutes. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bondia. So I will say that it varies. It does seem that in some cases there is data available and it's just not being shared. So that we know that, for example, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, they have a schedule of when they anticipate being able to release data, and they haven't released it for many, I think we're verging on years now in a row. So I think that's an example of a place where there likely is data and it's just not being shared. I think another case of that would be lead in water. We know for a fact, and that was the case in Flint, Michigan, and many other communities where they knew that there was lead in the water, they didn't make that public. So I think that that's likely happening in those cases as well. I'm sure there's many more. It's hard to know what you don't know. And I think that in other cases, it's just a case of inattention or choosing not to put resources on it. So I think there's really no one single solution, but I think that's definitely part of it.
Well, this is certainly part of the boldness of this report, so that we can really shine a light on what isn't being told as we think about it. President Frederick was in my history and philosophy of social welfare class. And one of the things we talked about with hospital data, hospitals very reliant upon Medicaid and Medicare. And so it's very, we have to think about why that data is not available, why those data, we don't have access to them. So certainly your report really shines an important light on this. Dr. Lusane. Dr. Lusane and I share a mentor, the late Dr. Ron Walters. And Dr. Walters often said that if it is morally wrong, it should be politically wrong. So how do you align the moral and the political with the report that you have shared with us?
So, thank you for that question. And Dr. Walters was absolutely right that we should not separate morality from the work that we do, the research that we do, and the policies that we would like to see. One of the things that's clear, and this is what Dr. Bond refers to, is that none of this means anything unless it's going to bring about change. And so the thrust towards policy, which is the overall aim of this conference, is absolutely on target, because what we want to see is change. Now, the reason we think this data is important is because it means change not only at the federal level, and we need national policies, but we also need state and local policies. And what I would like to see more is to bring together the academics and the scholars who are doing this work, and then the people who are on the ground who are lobbying, organizing, mobilizing, and working with policymakers to make this happen. And I think that's one of the great values of the movement for Black Lives, is that while it has focused on individual cases in many ways, it has also pointed to necessary changes needed at the policy level and across the country. And this is one of the things I write about. We've seen changes not only in Minneapolis, but in Houston and in New Orleans and in St. Louis and across the country, directly as a result of the activism that we've seen since May.
Thank you so much. Dr. Bond, you touched on an area that's just personal to me, and this is this whole report. For Howard and African Americans, this is both personal and professional. This is about our families that we're talking about. These are not invisible people on paper. These are individuals that we know that are impacted by the social determinants that you have spoken about. But the one that really, really got my attention was school desegregation. 54 years ago, I desegregated a school in Virginia. And I thought I was really ending what you are speaking about that's still existing today. And the other thing that struck me was that, and I will read this from the preliminary report, that with 22 states having more than 40% of children at two times the poverty line, children are in poverty. So we're not talking about an end to this. We're talking about a beginning, because children are at the beginning of their lifespan. So how do we use these findings to change the trajectory of our children who are in poverty? You're on mute, Dr. Bond.
Oh my gosh, I've done that several times today. Well, I first want to start off by saying, Dean Crewe, I didn't know that you had segregated some schools in your area. Was that Virginia?
Yes, that was in Virginia, 1966.
I wanted to just to highlight that a bit, because we often learn about Brown v. Board, to me sometimes in abstract, something that it's a long time ago, it's here forever, it's precedent, it's never going to go away, and in fact it has been chipped away in various ways. But to your question more generally, what does that means? What does it mean for us now? What can we do as we move forward? I think just first of all, making people aware of that. And once you become aware, then I think trying to understand the interconnected nature, because when you have segregated schools, they really don't happen by chance. You have residential segregation, you have white flight, you have poverty. All these things work to sort of create, it's systemic. And sort of understanding that deeper systemic nature makes you realize that policies, there's practices, way schools are funded, way you know, the resources that cities and states allocate to certain areas and don't allocate to others. You know, and that this has been a long fight. One of the things that we added in the report, just at the last minute, and I'd like to thank my colleague Alainna Lynch for willing to add it. And something that I didn't know at the time until we were doing the research is that the long history and the long fight that Hispanics, the Latinx population had in the same way, with various different cases fighting for integration in schools. And one other point I'd like to add to that. When you look at the school, when you look at schooling or education, you're looking at so many windows in a frame. What do I mean by that? You're looking at charter schools, you're looking at public schools. So, you know, this notion of choice. And to me, I think it's sort of muddied the frame. It's made it not as clear when you talk about school segregation, because it appears, and then you have situations where, you know, schools can take students from outside the district, but there are transportation issues. So you have this huge frame, but it's not as clear. And I don't think people realize the devastating impact of being in schools with others, you know, high poverty neighborhoods, not experiencing the diversity of, you know, of students, not having the level of resources as other schools do, because schools are primarily funded, you know, locally, statewide. So it's a really big picture, but it's a really impactful one.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, because as I think about the challenges in 1966, and you were telling me the same challenges exist today. I know these, but it still says that Howard must continue to be ever bold to battle wrong, because we have to, you know, pull up to the table and make sure that this voice is out there. As a social worker, what I really focused on in the report, we have 13 grand challenges in social work, and we started them 5 years ago, and they align themselves with your 5 social determinants. And I'll just share several of them so you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. We had ensuring healthy development of all youth, closing the health gap, advancing long and productive lives, and that relates to COVID-19, ending homelessness, that's food and housing insecurity, promoting smart decarceration, again, very much aligned with some of the things Dr. Lusane talked about, reducing extreme economic inequality, and building financial capacity for all, capability for all. And one of the things I really hope that as many people read this report as possible, because you did something unique. You use a strengths-based perspective. You didn't just talk about the problems. You really talked about how Indigenous communities, how Latinx communities, how the HBCU communities, how we have come together to really work toward a resolution to some of these areas. But I would add, we started with 12 grand challenges in social work. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we added an additional one, and that was eliminating racism. Because the assumption is what's underlying all of these social determinants is racism. So I think your report really highlights that, and I'm so grateful that I'm a member of a team in social work that's led by the Dean of the College of Social Work at the University of Utah, a Howard alum, who's looking at eliminating racism as one of the grand challenges of social work. That aligns itself beautifully with your report. Now, I don't know about you all. I know it must have made you a little angry when you saw these disparities still out there. But I think the Howard way is to take our anger and turn it into our responsibility. And that is what you have done with this report. And I am so grateful that I've had the opportunity to share this time with you. So as we close, I would like each of you to give me a closing statement so the audience can move forward and join you in the next discussion that you mentioned, Dr. Bond, on this important topic. You may start. Why don't I start with Ms. Lynch?
Sure. Can you just, would you mind reframing that for me real quick?
Give a closing statement for your presentation.
Yeah, I think I'll speak on the data gaps piece of it. And I think speaking to the academic audience, and I know there are so many brilliant scholars on the line here with us, I think there's a role that we all can play in addressing these data gaps. And I think it's important to work collaboratively and find ways to actually shine light and maybe fill with our research some of these gaps. And so I look forward to collaborating and following all of your lead in finding ways to do that.
Excellent way for student engagement in this project. Dr. Lusane.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really was struck by your idea of we should be angry. One of the things that just came out last week was data on children who are affected by the COVID and who have died. This isn't in our report because it literally just came out. Out of 121 children, 54 Hispanic, 35 Black, 17 white, which means 45% of the kids who have died have been Black. 29% have been Hispanic, 2, 3, 4 times their population, size of our population. So it really does matter who's making policy and who's in charge. And so again, this data is relevant because it should lead us to make the kind of changes where we can start to save lives. And so that's what I really want, the key message to be, that we really want, we're looking at bringing changes and moving to do better on all of these areas where you're absolutely right. Racism drives these disparities systematically and institutionally.
Thank you so much. Dr. Bond. Mute.
Seems like I can never remember to hit that, to unmute myself. I do really feel very strongly about this notion of righteous anger, righteous indignation. I was sharing with a friend the other day, my mother who died just a few years ago, something that she's been sort of known as the, we kind of call her the Rosa Parks of this local McDonald's. I was raised on a farm in Ohio. And they would go to this was about 15 years ago. And she never did see any Black workers in the area, in that restaurant, the local McDonald's. And she actually challenged the manager, with making a long story short. My mom and dad, my father still lives there on the farm, and they didn't go back for several weeks. But when they went back, there were actually people of color there working. And so small acts can make a big difference. This story is only known amongst the family, and every time when I go back and I'm helping take care of my dad, who's lonely there on the place, but we will ride through McDonald's, and every time a person of color gives us our hamburger and French fries, which neither one of us are supposed to have, I always think about she just challenged, just in a small act of, pushing back. And so, that's one way I remember her. And I feel very strongly about, taking what we do and putting it into action. And I do appreciate your remarks, and that you did happen to see that we did take a strengths-based approach, looking back at the strengths of the community and using that to inform the findings. So thank you.
Thank you, colleagues, so much. As I think about the work you've done, I'm reminded of Dr. Annabelle Burns-Lindsay, the founding dean of the Howard University School of Social Work. So you can add her to the Howard co-signers of your report. who brought into the social work community the sociocultural perspective and looking at all issues. And we now label it as the Black perspective. So I think there's sort of alignment there. My faculty recently completed a monograph on mental health and COVID-19. And certainly that is also something that I think will prove valuable as you move beyond your preliminary report. One of the things I would close with, we're awfully proud of our resilience, but we also should be concerned when resilience is the intervention rather than eradication of structural inequalities. Within my lifespan, I would like to have a level playing field. And so I think it's your work like this, that will really help us to get there, because the resilience increases our allostatic load and the John Henryism and all of those kind of things that go along with it. So I say to you, congratulations on work well done. And I'm looking forward to your report going public and taking a little piece of it and doing something with it to improve the quality of life of those we serve. Thank you very much.
Thank you.